With me on the virtual stage, I have Brian Glick, the editor-in-chief of Computer Weekly, who's been the writer most in tune with the progress of the Gov.UK Verify story over the last few years. Brian is responsible for managing and developing all of Computer Weekly's editorial content. He's also Vice President of International Editorial for Computer Weekly's publisher Tech Target, where he is part of the team leading the company's European and Asia Pacific expansion plans. Colin Wallace is Executive Director of the Kantara Initiative, the global non-profit multi-sector commons recognized for its digital identity assurance schemes and trust framework operations, such as NIST SP 863 in the US. Kantara also supports R&D funding programs such as H2020's NGI Trust in Europe, and community develops best practice specifications for international standardization. To give us the Whitehall perspective, we have Benjamin Barnard, who is the head of technology policy at Policy Exchange, where he leads Policy Exchange research into technology and the digital economy. Benjamin is the author of Verified, the UK's Digital Identity Dilemmas, a report which explored how to accelerate the use of digital identity in the UK. To give us the international context, we have Andrew Budd, CBE, who is the founder and chief executive of iProve, the provider of large-scale face-based authentication. Andrew will be able to give us the international context around EIDAS and provide experience of regional programs such as SingPass in Singapore. He'll also be able to talk about the delivery of genuine presence assurance. So Brian, kick us off here. In June, you wrote an article which broke the story about the planned launch of IAX. What is it? How did it come about? And what does it say about Verify?
Thanks, David. Yeah, unfortunately, we've only got half an hour to answer that question. Yeah, well, I think, you know, we all know, everybody's been involved in digital identity in the UK for the last few years has been watching with, you know, various degrees of horror and restraint as Verify has been rolling out and failing, unfortunately, to live up to all the hopes that we had for it and the promises that we had for it. And I think that's a really important point to make, is that there was so much goodwill towards what GDS, Government Digital Service, was doing with Verify, and so much hope that this would turn out to be the big turning point for digital identity in the UK. And as we all know, of course, it's been quite the opposite. It was interesting listening to Hannah just now. It's great to see somebody with such enthusiasm and interest in the subject talking, but with all respect to her, 80% of what she talked about has been exactly the same as what government has been saying for the last 5 years. It feels like every year government is telling us, hey, digital identity is really important. We've just realised we really ought to do something about it and work with the private sector on it. You know, we know that Verify is on the downslope now. We know that funding is due to be pulled from it within the next 18 months, year to 18 months or so. And so, you know, what I was told and found out and saw some documents was that there's this thing called IAX, the Identity and Attributes Exchange, which appears to be being set up as a new way for private sector identity providers to be able to access government services, so that you could have this holy grail of somebody who's taken out a private sector digital identity through a bank or an e-commerce provider or whatever it is, to also be able to use that to access government services where you need to prove that you are who you say you are. GDS has barely talked publicly about it. The document that I saw was dated January this year, so it's before the pandemic. So to be fair, the government has had a lot of other priorities since. But broadly, it seems to be a trust framework that is meant to act effectively to set up either a standards-based or virtual sort of gateway, if you like, that's going to link between government services, private sector identities, and potentially vice versa as well, and to try and address a lot of the issues we've had for many years around trust and liability and legal issues and commercial issues and all these sort of things. But the harsh truth is, at the moment, we just don't really know, because GDS isn't talking to anybody, and I think it's notable that GDS is not speaking at all at this event today.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Colin. I'll come to you in a minute and get your view. So, Brian, I mean, you did that article in June. Has there been any other musings or anything else that's sort of come out at all since then, or reaction to it? You know, we're in November. You know, it's a few months on. Is there anything else coming out that you've heard about?
Well, the main development since then was what Hannah referred to just now, which was finally the release of the government's response to the call for evidence a year after they'd originally promised it would come out. And generally, from the people I talked to around the industry, that unfortunately what came out then was pretty poorly received. A lot of people felt it. There was nothing concrete in it. There was no specific plans or actions. It was another round of, hey, thank you for telling us all these really interesting things. We're going to set up a board and we're going to come and talk to you, which again is just everybody, everybody in the private sector, in the digital ID sector has heard all this so many times over the last few years. I know there was a GDS commissioned another internal review of Verify. Halfway through the year, they brought in an external consultant as an advisor to do another review, who recommended, yes, we need to wind down Verify. It's not working, but we need to work out which are the best bits of it that we can still use. We also recommended coming up with a simple login system, and we've seen recently GDS announced a trial of what they're calling, I think, gov.uk accounts, which seems to be, a fairly basic standard level username and password type system that they potentially might hope to introduce across a large number of government services, so they can start associating users coming onto Gov UK with their activity on Gov UK as well. Which seems which is a sensible move, but it's probably what they should have done first, and then built out Verify from there.
Okay, thanks, Brian. That's a great summary. Colin, let me turn to you. You're one of the few people who has an understanding of what IAX might be. You told me you regard it essentially as a trust framework, leveraging the trust framework part of Verify. So is IAX essentially Verify 2.0? What's your view?
It's more a scheme than a trust framework, but that it may operate within a wider trust framework. But I think Brian made some very good points there about how it's potentially leveraging some of the best bits of Verify, and I think that's a fair point to make, because Verify was effectively a scheme of two halves, if you like. It had the rules and it had the gateway. And what I'm sensing out of this, and I could be as wrong as I could be right, that certainly the rules piece is the part that's being taken forward. Remember, that Verify was a very ambitious project when it was brought on. 2011, victim of timing to a great extent. Very, very difficult period, because it was towards the sort of the sunset of SAML and the sunrise of OpenID, but before the days actually of OpenID Connect. Still very, there were still some concerns there about security and so on, because much of that has actually improved. But it really did, in addition to actually creating a very structured and ambitious program of using brokers and force feeding, priming a digital identity ecosystem. Now, so of course, the predecessors to this hadn't done that. They had done this in a kind of sense of starting with something that looks very much like the accounts, gov.uk accounts does today, effectively a self-attested login service, and then basically late binding identity to it. That's what New Zealand did. That's what Canada did. That's what login.gov in the US has done. Pretty much everyone has done it that way, and it was very ambitious for Verify to do what it did. But look, all credit to them to to give it a go. But like, you know, when you're doing an ambitious project, you should be careful to fail it quickly when things aren't going well. And unfortunately, that didn't happen, and so we ended up with a lot of the situation that we have. But I do think that IAX has some potential, certainly, to reuse some of the taxpayers' money spent on Verify to bring up the scheme, bring that forwards to make it work. But it is a bit like, you know, building a trust framework is a bit like building a house. You don't go and build the house and have it completed and then come off for your, you know, go to the council to have your certificate of compliance. Actually, what happens is the building inspector is there all the way through, and that's what I'd love to see happen in IAX. That in fact there are checks and balances from folks that have been there before that can basically look at what's happening and offer some observations, so that you don't get to a point where the thing is built and presented and it's not fit for purpose, or there's too much friction or whatever. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. That's a very good analogy. Benjamin, give us the Whitehall perspective on Verify, its history and context as you see it, and an idea, if you like, of how Verify has been, how should I put it, buffeted by politics and in more recent times by the impact of coronavirus.
Brilliant. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm delighted to be joined by such an esteemed group of experts. The reason I'm really speaking to you is because I was fortunate enough to have an endorsement for the report that you mentioned earlier, which I wrote for Policy Exchange by the Minister for the Digital Economy, Matt Warman. And Policy Exchange is an independent educational charity. So when we approach a subject, the two really big questions we ask ourselves is this an area that doesn't get the sort of political attention that perhaps it deserves? And secondly, is there a massive gap in understanding between sort of policymakers and between sort of some of the practitioners in government, or, you know, that prevents it from being solved? And I couldn't really see an area where that was more true than in digital identity. And so it was really, really great to get it. What I would ordinarily say on these panels, because I don't just do digital identity, is that what's happened over the last 5 years in government is that we've had Brexit and we've then had the coronavirus, and that's taken up huge amounts of civil servants' time, huge amounts of political attention that often mean these incredibly important issues that are complex, take time for ministers to understand, don't get solved. What I think has changed, or what I think is unique to digital identity, is that the pandemic has shown just how necessary it is. So whereas for some very important things in government, the coronavirus has been a really bad thing, ironically, I think when it comes to digital identity, it's really shown government how important it is to get this right, particularly when you have a huge amount of public sector fraud, which is something that Policy Exchange has highlighted, and that is at the forefront of the minds of the Treasury and people around that. And so even though the comprehensive spending review has been delayed, I really think that people in government are very, very focused on solving this issue in a way that they haven't done so previously. And I think that's a cause to be celebrated. But the problem that you're going to have in government, it's a problem that you always have, is that trying to get individual departments to sign up to something that's been developed collaboratively is always going to be very, very difficult, despite the best efforts of the Government Digital Service, or despite however brilliant the sort of policy and the delivery of it is, because individual departments, for very justifiable reasons, want to be able to control all of their output. And so the big challenge for the government is, can it get something where you have everybody signed up to it in advance, and can you then launch with everybody committed to it? Because unfortunately the way Verify tried to set up is it tried to set up in such a way as we will create something and then people will join over time. And as a result, you're always going to have some resistance from other Whitehall departments to stop that from doing it, despite the best endeavours of the brilliant civil servants who work on it. And so that's sort of what I would say. I think going forward, you've got, I just say, as I understand it, in the end of the the end of the last Parliament last summer, the Cabinet Office retook control for cross-departmental data from DCMS, which it only took on DCMS in 2017. So as I understand it, and I think this is a very sensible move, by the way, DCMS are going to be in charge of digital identity in the private sector. We heard a wonderful speech from Hannah this morning explaining how that's going to happen. And in Matt Warman, you've got a really engaged minister there who really understands digital identity, who spoke on my panel and is really passionate about getting the problem solved. And then the government digital service are going to be working on how you do identity for government, and they're going to be led, I understand, by Julia Lopez in the Cabinet Office on that. I've engaged with her in the past, and she's also incredibly tuned in and very aware of the problems. You also have opposition MPs like Chion-Wura who also really get it. So hopefully what's changed since all of the things that Brian has talked about and the things that I wrote about in my report is that the coronavirus crisis has shown why we need to solve these problems. And it's why I'm delighted to be able to speak very briefly on the panel today with such a brilliant and esteemed group of experts.
Thank you, Benjamin. That sounds great. Andrew, talk to us about the international context here. What are the possible routes out of this maze? iProof's done work in Singapore, hasn't it? And you could perhaps tell us about how SingPass works and about the IDAS, which could be an opportunity for collaboration between different identity verification services. But I guess we must bear in mind the risk of taking on IDAS when we're leaving the EU and the realities there. So what are your thoughts, Andrew?
So we're in a very good position though, to look at the UK in an international context. We've actually been working in the UK identity space since 2016, when we were commissioned to do a pilot with HMRC on Government Gateway, just before Verify fired a shot across the bows of Government Gateway and delayed that. We've also been doing the onboarding authentication for the Home Office's EU settlement scheme, which is practically a 4 million person digital identity process. We are the onboarding provider for the NHS login, which is another digital identity scheme operating with great success in the UK. You're right, we're working very closely with GovTech in Singapore to provide strong authentication for SingPass. SingPass is interesting because it's a single national digital identity program. The Singapore government has a single national database of all of its citizens' information, including their photographs, which is a really fundamental asset. And that means that SingPass can now become a single sign-on solution for practically everything across the economy. When it was face-enabled, SingPass was launched as a means to log on to 500 separate government services across what is really a very well joined up government, but also is now being used by the private sector as well. So where you've got a single government database and a very powerful central department, as GovTech is, the Department for Technology, they can coordinate, and there is prime ministerial commitment, as there is in Singapore, to a smart nation. Then everybody can sort of align up evenly. We've been the first, and that's very nice if you can do it. But Singapore is about 4 million people, it's about the same size as Scotland. It's about half the size of London. We've been working. We're the first biometric authentication solution that has been included in a certification for the issuing of qualified signatures under the EIDAS scheme, and that's given us very close engagement with EIDAS, and we've been very impressed with it. Frankly, it's a bit clunky and bureaucratic, but as a trust framework, it actually is working increasingly well. I mean, in Italy, for example, there are over 20 trust TSPs. Similarly, in Spain and the Baltics, the entire economy now runs itself, public and private, practically off various forms of the EIDAS schemes. And that is a federated scheme. So there are multiple trust service providers and a legal framework, the EIDAS regulation, which the UK has incorporated. I mean, it's in UK law now that says that has to be mutual recognition. So multiple trust service providers can provide very strong authentication and, importantly, strong qualified signatures, which have to be recognized across different nations. So the people that we are authenticating for onboarding for qualified signatures, for example, in Estonia, those signatures and those identities have to be recognized by the British government. Quite what will happen after the withdrawal agreement, I don't know. What's quite clear in the UK is that we've had a huge problem. That on the one hand, we don't have identity cards, which is a central resource, a ubiquitous resource, which is an incredible basis upon which multiple digital identity schemes can be spun off, all with a trusted root. And that's common across all the Anglo-Saxon and common law countries. So we don't have that. Secondly, we have very powerful government departments which have built up infrastructures and, shall we say, a certain degree of institutional autonomy, and and it was quite clear under Verify that they refused to give up that autonomy and bend to dependence on a single solution. And I think the interesting thing about the recent new strategy, the significant thing was this creation of this digital strategy board, which admitted that no one government department was going to dominate over another. The creation of the digital strategy board said all the barons are going to have to sit around the table, and they're not going to be allowed out. You know, food and water will be pushed under the door, and they won't be allowed out until they come up with a solution that's interesting. What's the other significant thing is this trust framework that we've just heard. There is, in this panel, there's a bit of a confusion building up between the trust framework, which DCMS is consulting on, and IAX, which was a government digital service. What we're seeing, and they're actually quite different. The IAX is a piece of machinery, ultimately, as a way of getting attributes that the government knows about into the hands of people who need to know about it. The trust framework is a much more interesting thing, and I'm actually rather, the DCMS trust framework that Hannah was talking about before is actually a much more exciting thing, because it's actually a way of admitting that there are all these centers of power, not trying to crush them or get supremacy, but as a way of effectively, I read it as being a way of building an autonomous analog of EIDAS in the UK. David, as you said, we can't just. I would be very keen on just absorbing EIDAS, because, you know, if it's built and it works and all of Europe is relying on it, why do we have to reinvent it? Well, the answer is that one of the many effects of Brexit is that we're going to end up heading off. If we were just to invent it, we'd end up being unable to affect it and subject to its rules without being able to contribute to it. So I think what's interesting is the creation of a parallel and similar trust framework, which creates a middle ground between purely principles-based things and very descriptive processes. Look, in the authentication world, we have to get the British. We've seen the need to get the British approach right. In financial services regulation, for example, everyone says, well, just do the right thing, and so everyone does the minimum. In Germany, it's written down in very, very, very great detail exactly what you've got to do, and therefore there's no innovation. And I think what I'm hearing in the development of this DCMS trust framework is a very new and, to my mind, quite potentially a very exciting attempt to bring the barons, to give a framework which all the barons can live with, which Home Office and Treasury and DWP and the NHS and Cabinet Office can all live with, and actually enables them to build one greater thing. I just want to close by pointing out one little fly in the ointment. Depending on the outcome of Brexit, there will be no adequacy judgment, and Schrems II has now made the alternative mechanism, which everybody involved in GDPR had been hoping on, which was the use of standard contractual clauses. Schrems II has now thrown that into doubt. A particular victim of this may very well be the government. There are 4 million European citizens living in the UK, and it would be illegal for people to process their data under European law if there weren't a legal basis for doing so. And Schrems II, I think we found a way through it, but I think the government is going to have some serious problems moving forward with any kind of digital identity scheme whatsoever, if it can't find find a legal basis for navigating out of the increasingly dreadful mess that at the end of transition, without an adequacy judgment and without certain other judgments that Schrems II will impose upon it. This is a really, really serious issue, and nobody's talking about it, but it has the potential to blow up really catastrophically in everyone's face in about 6 weeks' time.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Colin, I mean, you've got international background and experience and knowledge. Can you comment on what Andrew's been talking about? When you were speaking beforehand, you gave the impression you thought IAX could be useful. You were moderately positive about aspects of it. Would that be a reasonable summary?
Yes, I suppose I just want to make a comment about the trust framework that Andrew's talking about. You know, because Kantara has not been involved in any of these. We've we've seen the early IAX stuff. That probably was around about the time that Brian did. I think in our case it was June, and we were invited to the DCMS work, but then not. So we're doing this, certainly completely blind in a sense, working off other people's observations and so on. But certainly one of the things I can bring to this is that trust frameworks, there's a lot of governments and countries all around the world are looking at trust frameworks, and you've got to be quite careful about how you do that, because the first trust framework in the digital identity space was actually FICAM, the Federal Identity, Credential and Access Management program in the US, which started this in 2011. Now it's interesting, as they go to second generation, what the learnings that they took from FICAM was that it was basically too heavy. And what I actually see exactly, the sense, what you're saying, Andrew, gives me the sinking feeling that actually we're going to just repeat that mistake, because the Americans are actually saying it was too heavy, too complex, there was too much baggage in it. What actually matters is the line of liability, the contract and the liability, from the consumer to the relying party, to the identity provider, to the assessor, to the scheme owner, the trust framework operator. That line of liability and contract is the actual thing that matters. And pretty much the rest of it is largely baggage. Nice to have, but at the end of the day, the thing that matters is line of contract.
That's one way of doing it, Colin. I mean, the EIDAS works on the basis of delegated responsibility and audits. So if people have been audited and passed audits, then that effectively breaks the line of contractual liability.
Thank you.
Yes, it does, but
let me just bring Brian back here.
It doesn't work that well either, remember? So
I'm conscious of time here, and I want to give Brian a chance to sort of come back. By the way, you will see notes in chat for the next sessions, the breakout sessions. Do keep an eye on those and click on those in 3 or 4 minutes time to go to the next session. But Brian, the sort of final words to you. Verify has been a long-running saga. What's your best guess about where public sector identity will end up? What questions still need to be answered? And what, in your view, would really represent progress?
Well, big question. I mean, I think it's clear that the big beasts in government are doing their own thing now. HMRC is pressing on with Government Gateway. Department for Work and Pensions is pressing on with Confirm Your Identity. Andrew mentioned NHS is doing its own thing. The Scottish Government is doing its own thing. Even Department for Business is looking at doing its own thing. I think at last count I counted 9 different digital identity schemes across the public sector, including Verify. I expect what we're going to see is people doing their own thing. I hope that GDS will focus on trying to find a way to enable private sector created digital identities to be reused to access government services, which as far as I can tell is what IAX is meant to help enable. I think what I hear the private sector most wants from the government is to open up government attributes. So in particular, passport and driving license data. That's controversial within Whitehall. Passport Agency is very wary of allowing high volume external transactions coming into its aging legacy systems. DVLA is very wary about data protection laws around its data. But I think the biggest thing the government could do would be to open up driving license and passport data and any other attributes within the private sector, particularly within local authorities as well, for private sector digital identity providers to use. And I think that the work that's going on in the financial services sector around open banking and know your customer and anti-money laundering is probably going to be the biggest driver for digital identity in the private sector. So at the, and this I expect is what DCMS is trying to enable. So the nexus of this is going to be probably IAX, or whatever it ends up being called, as the point at which the private and the public sector and the various different public sector systems meet, and we have to hope that it does do that.
Great, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, and I know we have the breakout sessions to come. Just to say thanks to Brian and all the members of their panel for their great insight on IAX. I'm sure Brian will be breaking many more stories on this over the next few months. So watch the columns of Computer Weekly for that.